In a city defined by extreme wealth, another reality is unfolding, hidden in plain sight. It is a worsening education crisis, fueled by a chronic lack of affordable housing. The most vulnerable victims of housing insecurity are New York's children. More than 140,000 students lack permanent housing, a number greater than the entire enrollment of the Dallas public school system. These students are constantly in survival mode. They face dismal outcomes, struggling with a grueling cycle that jeopardizes their future.
Across the United States, over 1.3 million students are identified as homeless. But nowhere are these challenges more striking than in New York City, which faces its worst housing crunch in over 5 decades. How is America's housing crisis dismantling the education of an entire generation? And what is being done to help the students who are most at risk? The scale of the student homelessness problem in New York City today is without precedent. Data from the 2023-24 school year revealed that nearly 146,000 children experienced homelessness. This record number represents about 1 in every 8 New York City public school students. It also marks a 23% jump from the previous year, continuing a 9 consecutive year trend where over 100,000 students were identified as homeless.
Under federal education law, these students are considered homeless even if they are not sleeping on the street. The categories include children living in hotels, motels, shelters, or those temporarily sharing housing with others. Others sleep in cars and other last resort spots. The soaring population of housing insecure students underscores an urgent need to build more housing. The crisis is partly driven by a chronic lack of affordable housing, compounded by a recent influx of immigrant families and asylum seekers. However, the rising numbers predate recent immigration, indicating that family and student homelessness is a long-standing New York City issue.
The consequences of housing insecurity for children can be dire. In Detroit, 2 homeless children tragically died this year from carbon monoxide poisoning while sleeping in a family van. In New York, the issue is particularly acute. More than 15% of all students in the city lack permanent housing. New York also has one of the highest rates of student homelessness among large U.S. school districts. For context, roughly 7% of Chicago's school children and about 2% of Miami's public school students were identified as homeless in recent years. The city's unique, long-standing legal agreement to provide shelter to anyone who asks for it makes direct comparison with other cities difficult. But the internal numbers are striking. In 2018, about 130 schools in New York had at least 1 in 4 students who were homeless. Within just 5 years, that figure ballooned to nearly 330 schools. Experts like Dave Giffen, executive director of the Coalition for the Homeless, have called the increase in homeless students profoundly obscene. The city's mayoral race has been dominated by debates over the housing crisis's effects on parents and renters, yet the youngest victims often receive far less attention. Current Mayor Erick Adams, who took office in 2022, had directed more funding to schools serving homeless students and hired new shelter staff. But with the mayor having dropped his re-election campaign, the growing number of homeless children is poised to become a pressing problem for the city's next leader. Former City Council Speaker Christine C. Quinn, chief executive of WIN, the city's largest operator of family shelters, argues that homeless students have not been made a priority. She states that the next administration has the ability to turn the page.
School can be the greatest source of stability in a child's life, but the disruption of homelessness often forces families to transfer schools mid-academic year. Every time a student moves schools mid-year, research shows they can be academically set back by up to 6 months. The result? Students lose time, they can fall behind, and they can disengage, according to Barbara Duffield, Executive Director of Schoolhouse Connection. The lack of available shelter spots means families are frequently placed far from their children's schools.
More than 40% of families are initially placed in a shelter in a different borough. This stubbornly high figure is cited by experts as an example of how the city fails to set up many homeless children for success. Children without stable housing face dismal educational outcomes and can fall into a brutal cycle. They are far more likely to drop out of school than their classmates, and failing to graduate is the single greatest risk factor for future homelessness. This cycle is reinforced by the profound impacts on academic success. Students living in shelters, in particular, drop out of school at
Additional studies show that those who do not receive a high school diploma are 4.5 times more likely to experience homelessness as adults. The reality of this struggle is illustrated by families like that of Latoya Iheanacho. For her and her children, home for a year was a shelter. Ms. Iheanacho's routine often began at 4 a.m., gearing up to take her children to their New York City public school. The trek, involving a bus and 2 trains from shelters in the Bronx or Queens, sometimes took 2 hours. The family often returned after dusk to mice-infested rooms. The children were falling behind in their classes.
Miss Iheanacho explained, "They didn't even have energy to do homework. They were tired and hungry." Miss Iheanacho, who left her job in mental health care to accompany her children, felt pressure to transfer them to a closer school. However, homeless students have a federal right to remain in the school they had been attending. She feared they would lose their community and feel lost in their classes if they left. This is one of the biggest disadvantages. Parents are forced to choose between uprooting their child or spending hours on transportation to keep them in their stable school.
As Jennifer Pringle, director of Advocates for Children of New York, noted, almost 20% of students in shelters transfer schools mid-year, which is unsurprising given that almost 40% are placed in a different borough from their school. The struggle is also evident in attendance and academic proficiency. Roughly half of all homeless students are absent for at least 10% of the school year. In fact, roughly 70% of students living in shelters were chronically absent during the 2022-23 school year. This compares to roughly 30% of permanently housed students. Furthermore, among children in shelters, about 75% lacked proficiency in reading in 2023. More than a third did not graduate on time.
Beyond academics, homeless students are disproportionately disciplined. 1 in every 32 students living in a shelter was suspended, compared to 1 in 49 who had secure housing. For well-off families, obstacles like finding a quiet space to do homework or needing an alarm clock might be minor hiccups. For homeless children, they can cause chaos. Experts have pointed to simple changes that could significantly help. For example, the city's schools chancellor has top deputies focused on other disadvantaged groups, such as children with disabilities, but no high-level official focuses solely on homeless students. Outreach efforts to families in shelters have declined. As a result, the enrollment of homeless students in pre-kindergarten, which can be highly beneficial, has dropped since before the pandemic.
The city's struggling yellow bus system adds to the strain. When Miss Iheanacho's children relied on the bus, they could arrive hours late to school. She was warned that their attendance issues could prompt scrutiny from child welfare investigators. The rising number of students in need is leading advocates to push for new solutions and funding. One strategy being championed is the expansion of this concept, which has existed since 2014, involves organizations partnering with schools to connect students with services like dental care, after-school classes, mentoring, and adult education. Former Governor Andrew M. Cuomo, running as an independent, has proposed converting more schools that serve homeless students into these community schools to improve outcomes. The Democratic frontrunner, Zohran Mamdani, has pledged to expand a pilot program in the Bronx that connects families in shelters with city employees for regular check-ins. This pilot program, conducted by the nonprofit Children's Aid, assigned student support coordinators to 29 housing insecure families. Coordinators helped families secure basic needs such as groceries, school supplies, or furniture. They also took students on arts and culture field trips. The support continued even after the pilot ended, offering long-term stability and continued check-ins. Coordinator Brenda Sanchez recalled helping a family that moved to Brooklyn find a new school and after-school programs. When poor school attendance was identified as a problem for another family, Sanchez drove the children to school herself. Building trust with these families, who were often hesitant to reach out for help, was a key achievement of the program. Preliminary data from the pilot, which was funded by However, Advocates for Children's Jennifer Pringle cautions that schools cannot solve the problem alone.
Without more support from other city agencies, she states, it's just not going to move the needle. This points to a need for system-wide reform and increased financial commitment. Pringle has also called on the city to consider that schools with high numbers of homeless students must constantly adjust their curriculums due to high student turnover. Currently, schools are not receiving any additional funding for students experiencing homelessness, despite the known need for additional support.
The need for additional monies for busing is also critical, especially for students whose families are placed far from their schools. Adding to the difficulty, there is a lot of stigma attached to being in temporary housing, to being homeless, to living in a shelter, including shame and embarrassment. New York State is currently examining its per-pupil funding formula for the first time in over 15 years, presenting an opportunity for change. The urgent focus on the next generation is paramount. As Schoolhouse Connections' Barbara Duffield states, many cities focus on homeless single adults, but the next generation of homeless adults is literally being created if we don't center schools in the conversation.
For Latoya Iheanacho and her children, the future has brightened. They recently secured a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens through the city's housing lottery. Since moving into their own apartment, Miss Iheanacho said her children have seemed less anxious about their future. This one family's path to success highlights the necessary solution. Stable housing is the foundation for a stable education. However, the fear of instability remains. Miss Iheanacho worries that an unexpected problem, like losing her job or trouble renewing the lease, could send her family back into a shelter. It's scary that we could be facing this again in 2 or 3 years, she noted.
The urgency of the situation in New York is reflected in the areas where student homelessness is highest: Upper Manhattan, the Southwest Bronx, and parts of Northeast and Central Brooklyn. In some neighborhoods in the Bronx, more than 1 in 4 children are homeless. This is the very same borough where a successful pilot program for specialized student support coordinators was recently implemented. The success of that pilot offers a viable blueprint for long-term support and stability. The challenge now is moving beyond pilot programs and integrating these successful, trauma-informed support models into the city's broader educational and social services framework. Children's advocates have called on the city to increase funding for services that specifically support homeless students. Ultimately, while schools can try as hard as they can, the needle will only move with comprehensive support from other agencies. The data is stark.
New York City is raising a generation of students who, without immediate intervention, are at a higher risk of perpetuating the very cycle of homelessness they are trying to escape. The city's population of homeless students has soared for a decade. It is an issue that, as advocates stress, should be the #1 priority of any city administration.
The debate about New York's housing crisis often focuses on renters and earners. But the stakes are highest for the 146,000 children whose right to a stable education is being compromised by the absence of a stable home. The question now is whether the city's next leadership will finally prioritize a comprehensive, cross-agency solution to secure housing and secure a future for its most vulnerable citizens.